Welcome to the session, National Social Pact on Unification, a model for social agreement on peace and unification on the Korean Peninsula. We have 4 professors, experts who are attending the session. From as far as Germany and the UK, the 2 professors have joined us. I would like to thank them once again, and I would like to briefly introduce the speakers and the panelists. First speaker, we have Professor Lee Dong-gi from Gangwon University. Could you wave your hand? Thank you. And from KIPA, Dr. Eun Jae-ho, who's the research director of public leadership, and Professor Kirsten Paul from Germany. Could you raise your hand? Thank you. And from Newcastle University, Professor Stephen Elstub. Thank you. Professor Lee Dong-gi and Dr. Eun Jae-ho will speak for 20 minutes each. And Professor Elstub and Professor Paul, you're given 15 minutes for your comments. And in the remaining time, we will have a Q&A. Without further ado, I would like to ask Professor Lee to deliver your presentation. Hello everyone, nice to meet you. I am not feeling very well, and so my voice may not sound as good. I would like to present my paper. The title is The Usefulness and Uselessness of Bettesbach Consensus for the National Consensus on Unification. In Chuncheon, in the province of Gangwon-do, 3 months ago, there was a social dialogue held among the Chuncheon citizens and university students about peace and unification. The national consensus on unification is being tried at the local level. I will skip this part in the interest of time. And I will go right into section 2 and read my paper. Starting from 2017, the scholars and the leaders of civic societies and experts have paid attention to Bettesbach consensus. The tripartite social partnership in Austria and the Netherlands, the National Economic Commission of Finland, and the Civil Council of Ireland, they have been reviewed along with the Bettesbach consensus of Germany. The agents behind the National Consensus on Unification did not have an exact understanding of Bettesbach consensus, but they knew that it was consensus about how to teach, so the methodology of political education. Compared to the other consensus models, it seems that Bettesbach consensus influenced the National Consensus on Unification on 2 fronts. It was a consensus amongst the progressives, the conservatives, and the centrists, and there was continuous influence of social acceptance. And I think we need to factor in 2 things about consensus. In 1973-6, the German political education scholars focused on consensus and discussed Bettesbach in a very productive way. Mr. Siegfried Schell said that we should avoid confrontational conversations about the ideology or content, but we should ask the participants how consensus could be possible. And second, this may sound like a paradox, but it was consensus which was not a consensus. In the strictest sense, it was not consensus. It is translated as Bettesbach consensus in Korean, but in German, the word was consens. So it should be actually agreement or, not an actual pact or a convention. So it is consensus, but not consensus. And during the discussions for Bettesbach, it was not that consensus was formed about the direction or the content of political education. The deliverables of the discussions came out as a book, and when it was published, no one raised objections. So that was equal to reaching a consensus. It was not legally binding or putting any political pressure. It was just the result of a democratic discussion about people who are engaged in political education. So people continued to criticize and discuss the Bettesbach consensus. It was not to be blindly accepted or to be recognized by the people. And on the other hand, in the Korean National Consensus on Unification, when the project was conducted from the very beginning, the target was to reach a consensus. It was based on the social contract model. There was the theory and experience of deliberative democracy and governance that they were interested in. And so they wanted to mobilize this consensus-based political process to guarantee the civic participation. So it was not consensus-based like Bettesbach, but actually confrontational. And moving on to section 3, the achievement and influence of national consensus on unification. Considering the confrontational political culture in Korea, it was very difficult to form social consensus on unification policy in Korea. But nonetheless, in 4 years, the social dialogue produced national consensus on unification. And that was because the approach was different from Bettesbach consensus. It was based on the citizens' participations, not just the experts' discussions. There were many players from diverse backgrounds. And it was not a simple meetings by the civic organization leaders, but the people who are behind the national consensus on unification had tried to coordinate their interests, and they knew from the very beginning that it would be difficult to form consensus. So it was not a coordination of different interests, but it was sort of a national contract type to invite participation from different citizens. And the deliverable was made into a non-official legal norm. And as to how this can be utilized and what influence it will have, we need to wait and see. So it's too early to tell the significance and meaning of national consensus on unification. And the agents behind the consensus say that the social dialogue focus more on the common traits than differences. So looking at the wording and the phrases in the national consensus, the sentences are less controversial, and this took a lot of time and effort and patience to coordinate. And through this, they want to utilize this in actual practice and politics. And this is the difference between the national consensus on unification in Korea and the Bettesbach consensus. The Bettesbach consensus in Germany was not an end to the controversy over political education. It was actually a starting point to invite more discussion. And through the Bettesbach consensus, there was more productive discussions that took place. And as for national consensus on unification, it would be desirable for more citizens and experts to criticize and to supplement and revise this. It should be a living document. Just by confirming the actual phrases in the national consensus unification and systemizing it should not prevent critical discussions and evaluations. Beutelsbach consensus has a life to its own and has this power to spread, and it did not just end with that. It invites more discussions and controversies. So it's not the wording that goes in the consensus that is important. It's actually the democratic discussion process, the culture that is important. So the national consensus on unification arrived at the destination that's different from the path taken by Beutelsbach consensus. And to raise its influence, it should be open to criticism and controversy. And we should propose to the people that it should be used as what should be discussed during social dialogues. And that could be a way to enhance the significance and meaning of national consensus on unification. So this was formed differently from Beutelsbach consensus. In order for the national consensus on unification to have life and lasting impact, we should leave the national consensus on unification open to criticism and further discussions. And moving on to section 4 of my study, Beutelsbach consensus was minimum consensus. It's not talking about the content of education. It was setting the principles of how to teach. So it built a bridge in the methodology between the two conflicting political sides. There was this difference in what should be taught in political education, but there was agreement made on how it should be taught. And there was a testimonial by a teacher from the East German region. The teacher said, through Beutelsbach consensus, we learned what not to do, but we never figured out what to do. And I think that's the core of Beutelsbach consensus. Minimum agreement actually leaves open all possibilities for actual practice and orientation. It just lays out the fundamental norms and principles. And the national consensus on unification is far from minimum agreement. The agents had in mind what was more than minimum agreement. They were very highly motivated and willing, and they didn't want to settle for minimum agreement. They knew that this was not a social contract per se, but they were influenced by deliberative democracy. So they tried to find as much common denominator as possible in the unification policies. And so they had a very comprehensive direction for the unification policies and the practical measures. And they had this destination in mind, and they tried to form consensus about the methodology and the process for unification. So coordinating between the conflicts and mediating is not at all about finding more commonalities and similarities, but the national consensus on unification was approached in that manner. I'm not saying that finding commonalities is a bad thing, but as for denuclearization, THAAD, declaring end of war, peace regime, the federation, the unification process, it's very difficult to have complete agreement. So they could not achieve maximum agreement, but they tried to go beyond minimum agreement. And so what the national consensus on unification turned out to be was just a series of beautiful phrases and sentences that pleases everyone. And the national consensus on unification includes two chapters, and the first is the desirable future of the Korean Peninsula. But if you talk too much on the norms, then it's difficult to constructively have a critical view. And actually, the future of the Korean Peninsula limits freer and creative discussions about the possible future of the Korean Peninsula because the end conclusion was already set. And there was not much talk about the ecosystem protection or feminism or the rights of the migrants or cultural diversity. The discussion scope was quite narrow, so the sentences that are included in the national consensus on unification are radically lukewarm. So, I'm sort of using these provocative expressions to invite more discussion during the panel. And so this was sort of a radical centrism-based consensus. It's not actually compromise or concession between the progressives and the conservatives, and it's not actually creative discovery or invention through compromise. Of course, I'm not saying that minimum agreement is king, but the national consensus on unification was not more than just words that please the ears. So instead of just these nice sounding sentences, we could have had more specific content about the consensus and the compromises. Then it could actually have a bigger impact in coordinating different interests and conflicts. So the national consensus on unification focused more on the bright future and on the commonalities. So they just covered up the actual thorny issues. So instead, I think we should lay the principle for contention to invite more pluralist and diverse ideas. And moving on to the last section, many people are putting on hold the idea of unification. So, in this sentiment, what significance does national consensus on unification have? Looking at the people's response to the unification policies of the Korean government, depending on how things turn out, the national consensus on unification may become useless, or it could be used as a means to pressure the conservative or the far right political figures who try to intervene in the reconciliation process between the two Koreas. But as long as there's hostility and isolation between the two Koreas, then unification may be put off even further. Then national consensus on unification may be irrelevant. The people are paying less and less attention to the issue of national unification. And interestingly enough, there was a lot of citizen participation that went into national consensus on unification. But it's not the less level of interest was reflected on the national consensus on unification because the discussions started with the imperative of unification in mind. So it was not an open-ended discussion, but the ending was already written, and people had worked toward this national consensus on unification, thinking that unification was a prerequisite. So in that sense, it should not have talked about the end, but it should have talked about the process. So even if the external conditions change, then the national consensus on unification will act as a backbone. It will provide us with the ways of how to approach it. Because some people may not look forward to unification and they may put it on hold. And some people may be skeptical and cynical about unification. And the national consensus on unification should not be an end to put an end to all the contentions and confrontations, but it should serve as a new beginning. The national consensus on unification should not be used as a measure to suppress criticism or to force uniform ideas onto the people. It should be open-ended. It should be used as a potential tool to put a check on the government and apply pressure if needed. At the end of November, when there was the social dialogue that took place in Chuncheon, the participants answered in the survey that yes, unification will be beneficial, but not many people said that they look forward to unification or that it will happen in the near future. So we need to revisit Bettesbach consensus and how this is still valid because it had focused on minimum agreement. So I think it would have been better if the national consensus on unification did not focus too much on the long-term plans or policies. I think it should have laid down the simple and basic principles about peaceful politics. So it's not so much about finding commonalities through dialogue. I think agonism or agonistic peace is much more important if we're talking about unification policies or politics in peace. Well, unfortunately, national unification consensus did not take that path, but it's too early to say that we made an error in forming the national consensus on unification in that manner. But we should be aware of what is missing in the national consensus on unification. And of course, we should focus on both the strengths and the weaknesses of the consensus and look at opportunities and some shortcomings. So that is the perspective I have on national consensus on unification. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. You talked about the national consensus on unification, and it had gone through the process of deliberative democracy. And Professor Yi talked about the minimum agreement, the agonistic peace and agonism, and you spoke about the national consensus on unification in a critical perspective. And moving on to the next speaker.
We have with us Mr. Eun Jae-ho, who can use maybe 20 to 25 minutes for his presentation. So please, Mr. Eun. Can you see my slides now? Now, I would like to talk about the contributions and the limitations of the social dialogue on peace and unification of the Korean Peninsula. I have 7 sections in my presentation. First, I would like to talk about the background in terms of the goal objectives of the national consensus activity, and I would like to talk about the overall project overview and the process and the procedure, what achievements were made. And I would like to talk about the implications and also the limitations of public deliberation. First of all, let me emphasize the geopolitical situation in Korea. One of the key reasons for launching this national consensus deliberation on unification is to resolve the conflicts between the two Koreas. And we were a victim of the geopolitical power struggle that existed in the region. So on the one hand, we had China and Russia, and on the other hand, Japan and the US. And we were at the intersection. The Korean Peninsula was at the geopolitical intersection. And so there are the maritime powers and the continental powers competing against each other, and we were victimized in that struggle. And we have been divided for several decades, and we have mixed views and conflict over how to view North Korea and how to understand North Korea. And so this is an important conflict that needs to be resolved, and this was the motivation behind the process of reaching national consensus on unification. There are other policy measures, of course, but national consensus on unification is really based on the deliberative democracy. And so I would like to talk about the social context in which this was pursued. This is actually from one of my research projects. In the past 20 years, communication has become an important topic in Korea. Conflicts, whether it's internal within South Korea or whether it's an international conflict, it is important for us to change the framework or the perspective in order to reach a resolution of the conflict. There are many issues that arose in the Korean society, and we've looked at whether the perception of fairness affects the perception of social conflict. In fact, the higher the perception of unfairness, the higher the perception of conflict. And we looked at two variables of private communication and public communication. Private communication means communication between friends or family members, and public communication takes place between the citizens and the public entities like the government. And we looked at the mediating effects of communication on the conflict perception, and we found that when there is increased perception of unfairness, the private and public communication are strengthened, and in particular, private communication is stronger than public communication in reducing is more impactful than public communication. So the government policymakers should actually get involved in private communication and not just remain in public communication. But it is very difficult for the government to intervene or get involved in private communication because Korea is no longer an autocratic country. And in order to do so, we need to have a public deliberation process where citizens engage in open discussions. So a small group of citizens can engage in a dialogue. Of course, in the process itself, the government would not intervene, but the results or the outcomes of the deliberation can be something that the government can take into account in improving its communication or improving its policies. So public deliberation helps. My second question was whether public deliberation actually helps improve or enhance the support for government policies. And there are also determinants of policy preference that we need to look into. For example, one's self-interest. And all right. I think the network. There's a network issue on Dr. Eun's side. Oh, so can you hear me now? Yes, we can. Apologies. At our lab, I think there was some trouble with the network. Let me share my screen again. My sincere apologies. So you've heard what I said on this slide. Yes, I do get this message saying that the network is unstable. Anyway, did you all hear my explanation about the moderating effects of public deliberation on policy support? So there are determinants of policy preferences that are mentioned in the previous literature, such as materialistic selfishness, symbolic attitude, and social-oriented perception. And these determinants have an impact on support for policies. And my question is whether public deliberation, including information provision and deliberative discussion, can such public deliberation moderate the effects of these determinants of policy preference on the people's support for government policies? So public deliberation involving the citizens in breakout sessions and group sessions could have a moderating effect, especially this materialistic selfishness. We could find that many participants in public deliberation would oftentimes sort of let go of their materialistic selfishness. So this implies that most people could regain their identity as a member of the public sphere when they engage in public deliberation. So we saw some potential for public deliberation having positive impact on reaching a consensus on unification. And so the objective, of course, is to prevent conflict and build consensus. And we did not focus on the democratic profile, but we actually focused on the political orientation of the participants. So there are the conservatives, there are the liberals, there are the center, and also there are leaders in the different religious sects. So 4 groups of people representing conservatives, progressives, centrists, and religious sector were invited to participate in the public deliberation. We felt that if the representatives from these different groups are unable to meaningfully participate in the public deliberation, it would be really difficult to try out our thesis. So in 2018, a civic committee on national consensus and unification was created to carry out this social dialogue. So in 2018, there was the pilot scale dialogue. There were 200 people who got involved. And a pilot scale consensus draft was created in 2019, which was adopted in 2020, and this was submitted to the National Assembly. But the National Assembly did not approve of this. So we were not able to actually establish this as a full-fledged national consensus or contract because there was no support from the National Assembly. But anyway, let me talk about some of the achievements. I think the most visible achievement is that we found the actual impact of public deliberation on perspective taking. And perspective taking is the important first step towards achieving a consensus. So instead of sticking with one's existing perspective, some people may be willing to take the perspective of the other person and work towards a consensus. So we wanted to look at the impact of public deliberation on perspective taking. And we found that the more favorable the participants' evaluation of information provided, the higher the degree of perspective taking. And also, the more favorable the evaluation of the group discussion, the more likely that perspective taking will take place. And also, there are some demographic attributes that may have an impact. So, of course, this could include political orientation, gender, age, and so forth. But I would like to skip to the next slide. So we found that the public deliberation process helped significantly enhance mutual understanding between the different groups of people who have had different perspective and resolve hostility among them. And so we sort of forced the conservatives and the progressives to sit down together and deliberate. And we found that this helped reduce the impact of echo chamber phenomenon. And by being able to learn and to share ideas, it was possible to alleviate confirmation bias. And there was an enhanced sense of empathy and understanding for the other side. And this is a significant interview. He said, in the early days of the social dialogue, our focus on competing with each other to win the debate. But as time progressed, what became important for us was that different perspectives can coexist, and we could find ways to coexist peacefully. And so this was probably the biggest achievement of our effort to conduct public deliberation. So how about the citizens who participated? More than 90% of the participants, who were just lay people, just citizens, believe in the possibility of resolving issues of peace and unification through dialogue. So they have learned to believe in this possibility thanks to the public dialogue and deliberation process. And they were willing to accept a consensus view that they previously did not agree to if they were reached through this public deliberation process. So I would like to touch upon some implications. So what is the greatest significance of the national consensus on unification? So in the past, many people remained in their echo chambers, and they often resorted to very extreme political views. But the social dialogue allowed for people to come out of their echo chambers and to face each other and talk with each other. Actually, echo chamber and the rational ignorance and confirmation bias do happen in real life, and oftentimes people like to withdraw support for any issues that they feel are against their views. But by providing information and by giving the opportunity for communication, such rational ignorance or cognitive errors, such like the confirmation bias, can be overcome. And by having this social dialogue, the government actually provided, bore the cost of engaging in this communication, allowing for many people to actively participate. And this helped reduce confirmation bias and the echo chamber effect. So going forward, what must we do? I think there is great lessons that can be learned from the Bettesbach agreement. For example, we need to, on a personal level, improve our skills for engaging in dialogues and to engage in reflection. And at the collective level, we need to provide a better environment for participation of members of the society in such discussions and to foster deliberative discussion. I think there is a network issue again. So when we have a sound public sphere, we will be able to engage in a healthier political activities and dialogue. So the national consensus on unification allowed for us to really delve into the conflicts that divided the conservatives and the progressives and allow them to jointly seek resolutions. And also, when a government unilaterally makes decisions, oftentimes there are starkly divided views on whether to support it or be against it. But with such public deliberation, people were able to share their views, and with this, they are more willing to maybe accept some of the policy suggestions made by the government. And also an improvement in the communication skills and strategies of the participants was another benefit of the public deliberation. And I also think there are some limitations on a more micro level. Actually, this process is more advantageous for the elite, people in the elite class. And also, there was the potential for manipulation of the public sphere on either side of the political spectrum. The Korean Ministry of Unification set as principle not to intervene. And in fact, they stuck to that principle very well. And I think that helped to achieve success through the public deliberation. So whether it's the observers or the facilitators or the organizers of the public deliberation, there was a risk of some sort of manipulation. But I think everyone involved were able to not engage in manipulation, and therefore there was some success. And also, there is the issue of not being able to guarantee responsiveness from the public agencies. In fact, the National Assembly failed to support the national consensus draft. And also, there is certain rules to achieve a limited consensus, and there may be differing views as to the 80% rule. Once again, apologies for the network disconnection that happened during the presentation. There were some pauses in his presentation. Despite that, I think we heard enough of the presentation to really get the gist. And Dr. Un got involved in the design of the public deliberation process for the national consensus unification. So we were able to learn from his insights. So maybe Professor Paul, can you deliver your comments?
Sorry, I was muted. Can you see my presentation?
Okay.
Yes, we can see. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, just a second. Okay, now thank you very much for your invitation to comment on Professor Lee's lecture on the National Consensus of Unification from the perspective of a German political education scholar. The goal of the Bettesbach meeting, as Professor Lee has already stated, was to identify principles for civic education that would be accepted by all political education scholars, regardless of their ideas about specific goals and content of civic education. As Professor Lee has argued, it only focused on educational methods and processes, not on educational ideology, content, goals, or vision. The consensus, as Professor Lee has also explained, was not a contract and it did not claim to be binding. The now famous wording of the three principles merely come from a conference report written afterwards by Hans-Georg Wehling, and he had been previously commissioned by Sigrid Schiele to look for the points of consensus in the controversial discussion and to report them afterwards. The ideological dispute over the content and concrete aims of political education between left-wing and conservative political education scholars was not ended by the conference either. And it took a full 10 years before the term Bettesbach consensus, as we know it today, first appeared. The Bettesbach consensus includes three principles that are widely accepted in Germany today. The prohibition of indoctrination, the requirement for controversy, the empowerment of the students to perceive and represent their own interests. The prohibition of indoctrination is specific to political education as a principle of teachers' behavior towards their students. They must not overwhelm them with their own positions and utilize the students' dependency on their teachers by imposing their own positions on them. Here, I do not see any connection to the discussion process about Korean national consensus on unification, because in the socio-political debate about this agreement, not students and teachers, but equal discussion partners are facing each other. The most widely received principle in Korea is the second one, the principle of controversy. It says that what is controversial in science and politics must also appear controversial in the classroom. The principle has been discussed in Korea, as far as I know, mainly in the context of the rising criticism of the mandatory political neutrality of teachers and the exclusion of political controversies in schools. What role can this principle play in a socio-political discussion about a consensus in a policy field such as unification or peace policy? Controversy is, first of all, the opposite of consensus. However, the principle of controversy assumes that a basic consensus is needed in order to be able to practice controversy in a pluralistic society. How broad this basic or minimum consensus must be has been discussed extensively in Germany in recent years with regard to political education. In most cases, three democratic norms are regarded as inevitable: human dignity, the principle of democracy, and the principle of the rule of law. For political education, this means that positions that do not accept these basic values must be rejected with normative arguments in political education processes. Extremist positions, conspiracy theories, fake news, and other undemocratic positions are to be discussed in class, but are not to be accepted as equally legitimate. Positions of different democratic parties, on the other hand, are considered equally legitimate, and the principle of controversy demands that different democratic positions must be presented by the teachers on each topic so that the students can form their own judgments. Since the principle of controversy of the Bettesbach consensus is only about political education and not about socio-political discussions, it seems to me that maybe Ernst Frankel's theory of neopluralism might be more relevant than the Bettesbach consensus when it comes to the question of how far a social consensus can and must go in a pluralistic society. Frankel distinguishes between an overlapping consensus and a field of dissent, which are both necessary for pluralistic societies. So dissent is not negative. It's not only the outcome of materialistic selfishness Professor Yoon talked about, but of different values, political orientations, position in society, and so on. The overlapping consensus only includes widely accepted fundamental and human rights and fundamental rules for political processes, as well as basic rules of dispute in a state and a society. Besides this overlapping consensus, there is a field of dissent, which is equally necessary for a democratic society, where dissent can prevail and where one can and even should argue about political issues. In contrast, the national consensus on unification, with all due respect to the outcome of the social dialogue, seems to strive for a very far-reaching consensus in terms of substance, which runs the risk of pushing back the field of dissent in a way that is questionable for a pluralistic society. Since the basic rules of dispute constitute the core of Frankel's concept of an overlapping consensus, his theory also connects well with what Professor Lee said at the end of his lecture. It might be wiser to create a minimum conflict rules to encourage productive debate and inevitable competition, rather than identifying commonalities and agreements through dialogue. Finally, a brief comment on the third principle of the Bettesbach consensus. Empowering people to recognize and represent their interests is an important goal of civic education. Behind this is the concept of human beings as politically responsible citizens. It is also based on an understanding of democracy that depends on legitimation by participation and on deliberative processes, or as Professor Yoon stated, communication beyond echo chambers. The intensive participation of numerous civic players in the social dialogue on peace and unification and the numerous deliberative processes show that the idea of the social dialogue is based on similar conception of human beings and understanding of democracy as the third principle of the Bettesbach consensus. I'm done, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul.
Professor Paul talked about the presentation by Professor Lee on National Consensus on Unification. And moving on,
I would like to invite Dr. Stephen Elstrup to deliver his comments.
Thanks very much. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. So firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to contribute today. We're very pleased to be here. Now, I have expertise on deliberative democracy, not on Korean politics, but I'm learning a lot from this session, but my comments will be focusing on the deliberative democracy element primarily. However, what I see happening in Korea with the social dialogue, it looks like a very ambitious, important and impressive processes for public engagement. I would like to comment about two broad points. Firstly, what actually happens within the social dialogue, but also the role of the social dialogue in Korean politics more generally. And the first point I want to raise is about the use of the term social dialogue, because for me, dialogue is something different to deliberation. It's exploratory. It's about trying to understand people's differences, but it's not about trying to resolve those differences, to find common ground, consensus, as we've been talking about a lot, and to decide what is to be done. So deliberative democracy is different. So I'd urge for explicit focus on deliberative democracy rather than social dialogue. At the moment, it seems the terms are being used interchangeably, and like I said, I think we need to withhold a distinction between deliberation and dialogue. So what for me then is deliberative democracy? Well, the key principles of it are that it's a decision-making process where people provide reasons for what they want to happen. They remain open-minded as to what should happen. Therefore, they're willing to listen to the reasons and arguments put forward by others without entering the conversation, having already made up their mind. That's part of being respectful then, is that they're willing to listen, but they're also willing to sort of seriously engage with the reasons and the suggestions from others. That it's inclusive, that everybody gets a say, and that it's consequential, that the deliberation actually leads and contributes to the decision that's going to be made. And it's thought that this is a good approach to democracy because it's either fair, or people say it leads to better decisions through pooling all our information, our reasons. We lead to more informed preferences, we lead to more informed decisions. Also a focus on the common good. It's hard to justify selfish interest to everybody else. So you have to look for common ground, reasons that everyone might be willing to accept. Next, then, citizens' assemblies or mini publics, which relates then to the Korean social dialogue. But the first thing is that I would say is that this isn't deliberative democracy per se. This is just one way of approaching deliberative democracy in practice, and it should not be equated with being the same as deliberative democracy. But I think what's happened within the Korean social dialogue is you have many key features that we see in citizen assemblies. There's balanced information being provided to the participants. The discussions are being facilitated to promote deliberative norms, the ones that I've just been highlighting, and that they are resulting in some recommendations of what should be done. But I think that there's a couple of elements that could be going further, and this is ensuring that the participants are representative of the population at whole. I know some sampling has been occurring, but it's about as well lowering the barriers to participation. There's a picture of lottery balls there, because it's really important to the legitimacy of these processes that everybody had an equal chance to be selected. It's really important that we remove the barriers to political participation that prevent many people from participating. So quite often in processes in the UK and in Europe and elsewhere, there's financial incentives to participate. Childcare is provided, all travel and everything like this is provided. So I wasn't sure if these sort of arrangements are in place in the Korean processes, so I'd like to hear more about that, but I think it's really important to do so. In fact, I'll go further and actually suggest that we should look for the over-representation of the most marginalised in these processes, as they are the ones who so seldom get heard, but also whose decisions tend to affect the most, and so perhaps their over-representation could be justified. And this then, I think, can lead to a more accurate sample of the population, which is kind of what citizen assemblies and mini publics are relying on there. So you've got a picture of a chef there tasting his soup or his sauce, because public opinion research has shown us that we don't need to ask the whole population what they think to understand, that we could just use a sample if that sample is robust and generally representative of the population. So when a chef is making a soup or a sauce and deciding whether it needs more seasoning, they don't need to eat the whole lot and then decide, oh, actually, we just needed a bit more salt. They just need to take a sample to know whether it's seasoned correctly. And this is what we're trying to get to with the Citizens Assembly approach. And this is because then the reason why, like I said, I don't want to equate citizen assemblies, mini publics with deliberative democracy per se, but they do provide important democratic values that perhaps we don't get elsewhere if done correctly, because normally political participation is democratically skewed. We get the usual suspects, the same type of people, the most interested, most mobilized, who participate in politics. If we don't, then sometimes if we look to the least active, through an opinion poll or something like that, then we get uninformed public opinion. You ask somebody what they think about an issue, they'll tell you just simply because you've asked them. It may be an issue in which they know very little and which they've given very little consideration. Also, the most politically active tend to be closed-minded. They come with their interests, they come with their mind made up. And we're trying to get processes where people are willing to be open-minded and listen to the other side. So mini publics, citizens' assemblies can overcome some of these problems, but it is really, really crucial to get that diversity in the sample in the first place and to lower the barriers of political participation in order to achieve that. Another theme about inside the citizen assembly, within the mini public, is I think for it to be more legitimate, the participants can be given more say. Deliberative democracy is meant to be an emancipatory ideal that through deliberative democracy, people can gain autonomy over their lives. If you're in a mini public or a citizens assembly and everything's been decided for them, and they're just sort of like taken through this process of which they have very little control, it's hard to see how emancipatory that's going to be. And so my research has suggested that the participants, if supported properly, can have a say about what the remit of the Citizens Assembly should be. There's a danger here that they can take it too far away from what policymakers are looking for. So it could be like a two-way general process in which, policymakers say, look, we're interested in knowing what the public think about this topic. You have your social dialogue or your citizens assembly, your mini public, and they then are able to narrow and find that remit to something more specific. In then deciding how to address that remit, they should be empowered to decide what types of evidence they need to answer it, the types of people they need to hear from to provide that evidence, and how they should actually come to reaching a decision. There's been a lot of talk about consensus making processes, but how do we make that final decision? There's different ways of doing it. And again, the participants should have some input into that. So that's what happens inside the process. Now, the role of social dialogue within the Korean political system more generally. And I think we need to think about it, deliberative democracy, on a systems level. So rather than just a forum of just some people coming together to deliberate, we want to try and get these norms of deliberative democracy that I outlined at the beginning of my talk across the political system as a whole. What we're looking for is a deliberative democracy, not instances of democratic deliberation. And it's not enough just to then have mini publics. It's not enough to have citizens assemblies, even a series of them like we've had in Korea, because ultimately it's still a small number of people. So we have to look at how that mini public relates to other institutions, which I'll come to. But ideas around the deliberative system then is we want to scale up deliberation beyond the forum, beyond a few people, to a system as a whole. In doing so, then we need a division of labour. Not any one institution is going to be able to achieve all the norms of deliberative democracy that I outlined all the time. Some will be able to promote reason giving, others will be able, more likely, to arenas for open-mindedness. Other places can be more inclusive than others. And we need to then combine these different institutions to get all those norms across the system as a whole. And as a result, then we have a continuum of deliberative standards where we're not expecting each institution to achieve the same deliberative standards. So in taking this more systems idea, we can think about then how the mini public relates to government, its relationship to government. So what's the best way to ensure that the mini public is actually going to have influence on government and parliament? What's its relationship to parliament going to be? How can it feed in and influence debate within parliament? How can civil society feed into the mini public, but how can they respond to the recommendations that come to the mini public? And how can the media report about the mini public so that it's not just the participants in the mini public that are joining in on this conversation, but the public as a whole? So we need to start thinking more about the relationships mini publics have with these different other parts of the system within Korea. And I think I was impressed by Xiaowen's talk, because I think he's moving in that direction already. I would encourage him to continue further in that direction. The media is very important here. One of the findings from my own research from the UK is that unless the public as a whole know about the mini public and what their recommendations are, the government doesn't necessarily feel a compunction to actually implement the recommendations. Similarly, though, the media won't necessarily report upon the mini public in a big way unless the government acts on the mini public's recommendations. Otherwise, it's just deemed not to be newsworthy. So it is a real challenge for a mini public to have impact. There's like a double lock. It needs to influence the public in order to influence government, but it can only influence the public if it influences the government. So it's a significant challenge, but it's only through thinking in these sort of system terms that we can start seeing these relationships and thinking about these relationships and analysing these relationships. So just to conclude then, I would say that firstly, be explicit about deliberative democracy rather than social dialogue, but try and make sure that the most marginalised are included in these processes, give those participants more control over the processes, think about how that they relate to other parts of the political system. And Xiaowen was talking about the end of his talk about institutionalizing mini publics, and I think that's the next step, and that's the direction that we need to head in. He mentioned the Belgian model from Belgium, which I think is an excellent example. It's also very early, it's also a very new process, so we can still learn lessons from that. But the key thing is to think about then scaling up deliberative democracy for the Korean political system as a whole, and not just the social dialogue elements of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Elstov mentioned mini publics, and I listened with great interest his discussion about the mini public and its relationship with the other elements of the system. So I learned a lot from the panel discussion. We have about 20 minutes remaining. So I have questions for each presenters, and I will listen to the responses, and then we will enter into a more comprehensive Q&A. First, I'd like to ask a question to Dr. Eun. Well, creating the public sphere I think has some philosophical aspects, and deliberation is seen often. Many people expect deliberation to result in consensus, but that's very optimistic view. And I think it's not necessarily the case. So what sort of approaches can we take to overcome the limitations of the public deliberation? And also, are there certain side effects that might result in negative outcomes, and I think, can you touch upon some of the potential side effects of this process of public deliberation?
I have a question for Professor Paul. We have this fundamental issue. When we are dealing with unification, we are not involving the North Korean residents. It's a one-sided dialogue and one-sided consensus building. In Germany, when you are setting the agenda for political education, if we are to discuss unification without North Korea, is this feasible? I am interested in what you think about this. And I have another question for Professor Lee. As for the national consensus on unification, the opposition party was excluded because the ruling party, in order to distort the party politics, they are using this national consensus on unification. The opposition party was very critical of this process and the result. So in that sense, did this process exclude the party politics? Do you agree with this opinion from the opposition party?
Finally, to Dr. Elstup, I'd like to ask about the mini publics. Well, there are identity politics being played out globally. And so on the one hand, we have the identity politics, and then, is there a conflict between identity politics and scaling the mini public? Because identity politics has created a lot of conflict across the globe. But does it not perhaps conflict with the idea that the mini public can expand automatically? Dr. Lee, thank you very much for very relevant questions. And each question, I think, was very, very important. And the four questions are linked with each other. And I am very impressed with the questions that you have asked. So I'm going to just respond to the particular question you addressed to me. And the public deliberation, of course, has philosophical significance. So how are we going to translate the term public opinion into English, the Korean word for public opinion into English? Habermas uses public opinion, but the Korean word for public opinion may have slightly different connotations, and I think it's closer to true opinion. Plato used a similar concept, and in Asia, we have this concept of true opinion politics. So this public opinion forming has philosophical significances. So is there actually a truth that we can arrive at? And I think that question is also involved in the concept of true opinion as we see and understand in Asia. So an important question related to this is this: can we really achieve consensus through, deliberation? and through discussion? And I think that was Dr. Lee's question. And I think the answer is yes. But the immediate outcome of discussion is that we first recognize the differences we have amongst us. And the discussion allows us to recognize the differences first. And the recognition of difference can be a stepping stone to reaching a consensus, because without being fully knowledgeable and understanding of what differences there exist, it's really difficult to achieve meaningful consensus. So if we look at the deliberative processes in Korea, only about 10% or even under 10% of the participants actually change sides. Sometimes under 5% of the participants actually change sides. But the percentage of participants who say, I finally understand my own views, is quite high. So perhaps the deliberation process helps participants understand their own views and really define their own views. And the more you understand the views you hold and also the views of the other person, you can engage in perspective taking, and this can help the group reach a consensus. So in that sense, deliberation has the potential to create consensus, and it is in line with the principles of democracy. So what is truth? How can we reach truth was the question, the philosophical question that I raised before. But if we start to fight about what truth is, we will never be able to achieve consensus. But the Bettesbach consensus shows that if people can agree on the procedure for pursuing consensus, it is possible to achieve some sort of a consensus. And I think this is why deliberation can be an important cornerstone of democracy. And also, you talked about negative side effects of the public opinion formation or deliberation. Well, there are certain negative effects or side effects that can occur in the Korean context because we are not used to this sort of deliberative process. And even with regards to many publics, there are a lot of controversies or mixed views, even in Europe. And as social consensus is formed about many publics and their role, I think we will be able to achieve better outcomes.
Professor Paul, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. I don't really know if I got you right, but if I got you right, I would answer that to take into consideration the North Korean position is just not possible at the moment. Therefore, the legitimacy of the consensus is limited in any case. I think there's currently no possibility of a joint dialogue between North and South Koreans. And therefore, I would suggest to increase the legitimacy of the dialogue or the deliberative process through the measures that Dr. Elstop suggested, and I think that are very important. So involve the marginalized groups and have a more open discussion. Also on the goal of the deliberation. I know that unification is prescribed in the Korean constitution, but I think there should be a discussion about the goal of unification and whether it would be better to talk about peace policy than about unification policy.
Thank you very much for the response. And now moving on to Professor Lee. Professor Lee, you asked me a very good question, but before answering your question, I'd like to make a comment about deliberative democracy. Deliberative democracy itself is organized or organized citizens or organized institutions become personalized, and the personal opinions are shared in that sphere of deliberative democracy. And in producing the national consensus on unification, this was started with hostile confrontation in the people of South Korea. So was deliberative democracy a proper tool? Of course, we had this visible outcome, but for national consensus on unification to grow further, should we limit ourselves to deliberative democracy? I think that we should move beyond deliberative democracy. And this connects to your question, Mr. Moderator. The opposition party looked at the national consensus on unification and criticized this as distorting the party politics. And I know where they're coming from, I think. I know why they're criticizing that. A lot of the things done through party politics could be invaded by and be overridden by other policies made from deliberative democracy or other measures. But it could be another party that can raise this objection. It could be the Green Party or it could be the Justice Party, not that strong opposition political party, because their voices could be overridden by this deliberative democracy per se, and they may feel discomfort about the process itself. And so to answer your question, I don't think it's just a problem up to the opposition party feeling marginalized and alienated, raising questions about the legitimacy of the process. I think they're all legitimate objections. But I think this comes up because we try to squeeze in too much into this deliberative democracy. Unification and peace policies are grand subjects. I think we could have made some structure about, what we should not do in peace policies and unification policies. Even the progressives should have come up with some principles that were self-reflective. Then I think the level of acceptance from the opposition party would have been higher. So yes, there is a need to be open to all types of criticism. The conservatives have the right to criticize. This is a very special form of process, and it will invite different types of criticism. And we need not limit ourselves to deliberative democracy. We can rely on other measures. We can try out new systems and measures. And as I mentioned before, the national consensus on unification should be the starting point of inviting more discussions and criticisms. and not be the end result of the discussions. So as we have more discussions, then we'll be able to accept constructive criticism and evolve this further. But if this is excessive, unconstructive political propaganda, then we should be able to fend that away and have the right structure for social dialogue. Thank you.
Dr. Elstad, would you like to respond to the question?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good question. Identity politics is causing a lot of conflict, but that's why we need deliberation. Is because people are different and people want different things, and we need to try and resolve those differences and come to some agreement on the way forward. So deliberation is crucial in that process, and mini publics are crucial then in promoting that deliberation, and they have worked in deeply divided societies in Northern Ireland, for example. One of my colleagues here at Newcastle University organised a deliberative poll that brought together Catholics and Protestants to discuss, education policy. And actually, all of the mini publics I've been involved in and seen, they are addressing sort of controversial issues, and yet people routinely discuss those issues in a respectful way. So despite those differences being there, they are willing to engage with each other. There are, of course, limits on then scaling up the mini public sort of process. I absolutely agree with that, and that's kind of what I was trying to get at with my talk as well, by saying let's not just think about mini publics, but let's think about the political system as a whole and how we can have more deliberation across the whole system, not just rely on the mini publics to promote deliberative democracy.
Thank you very much. Thank you for obliging me with good answers. We don't have much time, but do we have any questions from the floor?
Hello, I am Do Hee-yoon. Thank you very much for your presentation. I actually have a question for Dr. Eun, because I think you were the most deeply involved in this process, so you probably know the details of the process. In my memory, during Park Geun-hye administration, there was another organization that pursued this public deliberation to form consensus on unification, but it failed, and this process began again with the initiatives of a different organization. But I think there were many messages within this draft document that could be agreed to by both conservative and progressive, and I wonder why it ultimately failed. So going forward, in order for this consensus to be finally result in some sort of a meaningful contract, what sort of efforts do we need? And regardless of which party wins the next presidential election, is there a way in which we can achieve success in achieving this national social consensus and unification? So what sort of recommendations do you have? Thank you very much for that question. In order for the national consensus on unification to succeed, the answer is actually in Dr. Elstad's presentation. So there needs to be some support from the representative bodies like the government and the parliament, and the National Assembly or the parliament should be able to accept the recommendations from the citizen assembly. But we did not involve the parliament in the process, we didn't intentionally exclude them, but they were not willing to participate in the early processes of the public deliberation. So in that slide about mini publics, there's the government, media, and the parliament, and they need to be, in a way, engaged in the public deliberation process in some ways. And Professor Paul talked about the three principles of the Bettesbach consensus.
Prevention of indoctrination, principle of controversy, and empowering the participants to understand and represent their interests.
These three principles are not different from the principles of deliberation, and if we are able to respect those principles, we will be able to achieve a consensus on unification based on deliberative processes. Thank you very much. There is a question from YouTube. There is this question. Although there is this national consensus on unification, but there is declining interest in the unification agenda, and there's a declining interest about North Korea. So what can we do? Well, I think we need to try to raise greater interest in this very topic in order to be able to successfully continue with the public deliberation on unification issues. So we need to raise awareness as part of making this deliberative process more successful. So I think this is something we can all agree on. So thank you very much, the four professors, for your presentations and your panel discussion. The Moon Jae-in administration has worked really hard to promote the potential for unification, and I don't know whether this can continue in the next administration. I think it will, whichever party wins the election. Once again, I would like to thank our international speakers from Germany and UK for joining us so early in the morning and giving us such insights and great advice. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank all of you for joining us today. And also, I would like to thank the PyeongChang County and the organizer of the PyeongChang Peace Forum for your efforts. Thank you.
수고하셨습니다.